In the dusty archives of military history lies a collection of testimonies so brutal, so unflinching in their honesty, that they have remained largely hidden from public view for over a century. These are the confessions of men who served in the French Foreign Legion during its bloodiest and most formative decades, the 19th century. Their words reveal not tales of glory and honor, but accounts of survival, savagery, and the complete erosion of human dignity in the service of French imperial ambitions. The French Foreign Legion was never intended to be a noble institution. Created by royal decree on March 9, 1831, under King Louis-Philippe, it served a dual purpose that would define its character for generations. Officially, it was established as an infantry force, composed entirely of foreign nationals to serve French interests overseas. Unofficially, it was a convenient method of ridding France of political dissidents, revolutionaries, criminals, and other undesirable elements who might otherwise destabilize the homeland. From its very inception, the Legion attracted men with nothing left to lose, deserters from other armies, failed revolutionaries, murderers fleeing justice, and the dispossessed of Europe. These were not patriots fighting for a cause they believed in, but desperate souls seeking either redemption or oblivion. The French government understood this perfectly, viewing the Legion as expendable human material that could be deployed to the most dangerous corners of their expanding empire without domestic political consequences. The Legion's early years were marked by catastrophic losses that would have destroyed any conventional military unit. Within months of its formation, thousands of legionnaires were shipped to Algeria, where they faced not only fierce resistance from local populations, but also diseases for which they had no immunity, and conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Yet it was precisely these brutal circumstances that forged the Legion's legendary reputation and gave birth to the testimonies that would later shock even hardened military historians. What emerges from these confessions is a picture of warfare and military life so savage that it challenges our understanding of what civilized nations were willing to inflict in pursuit of empire. The accounts speak of executions carried out by fellow soldiers, of wounded comrades abandoned to die, of prisoners tortured for information, and of a military culture that not only accepted but actively encouraged brutality as a necessary tool of survival and conquest. These testimonies were not written as propaganda or heroic memoirs, but as private confessions, letters to family, diary entries, and deathbed accounts that were never intended for public consumption. They were discovered decades later by historians sifting through military archives, personal collections, and the papers of chaplains who served alongside the Legion. Their authenticity is verified by cross-referencing with official military records, medical reports, and contemporary accounts from other sources. The geographical scope of these confessions spans the Legion's early theaters of operation: the brutal conquest of Algeria, the devastating intervention in the Spanish Carlist Wars, and the savage campaigns in French Indochina. Each theater produced its own particular horrors, documented with disturbing clarity by men who had witnessed the complete breakdown of conventional military ethics and human decency. Understanding these confessions requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of colonial warfare and the human cost of imperial expansion. These accounts reveal that the brutalities committed by the French Foreign Legion were not aberrations or the actions of rogue individuals, but systematic practices that emerged from the unique circumstances of their deployment and the desperate character of the men who served in its ranks. They force us to examine how quickly civilized society's veneer can be stripped away when survival becomes the only moral imperative. The birth of desperation. The royal decree that created the French Foreign Legion emerged from a convergence of domestic political pressures and imperial ambitions that would shape the unit's brutal character from its very first day. King Louis-Philippe faced a France still reeling from revolutionary upheavals, where political dissidents, failed conspirators, and social outcasts posed constant threats to stability. The Legion offered an elegant solution: transform these troublesome elements into instruments of French expansion overseas, removing them from domestic politics while exploiting their desperation for the Empire's benefit. The recruitment process itself was designed to attract society's most desperate men. Unlike regular French army units that maintained standards of citizenship, background, and character, the Legion accepted anyone willing to sign a 5-year contract, regardless of their past crimes or current circumstances. Recruitment officers set up stations in seedy districts of major European cities, targeting men fleeing debts, criminal charges, or broken lives. The only requirements were physical fitness and a willingness to abandon one's previous identity. Even one's name could be changed upon enlistment. Colonel Christophe Négrier, one of the Legion's early commanders, wrote in his private correspondence that the unit was composed of the refuse of all nations, men who had burned their bridges and sought either death or a new life in service to France. His clinical assessment of the legionnaires under his command revealed men driven by motivations far removed from patriotic duty: German deserters fleeing court-martial, Italian Republicans escaping Austrian persecution, Spanish Carlists avoiding execution, and French criminals seeking amnesty through military service. The physical appearance of early legionnaires shocked even veteran French officers accustomed to rough soldiers. Captain Jean-Baptiste Flandin described his first sight of a newly arrived Legion company in Algeria. They arrived more resembling convicts than soldiers, gaunt, desperate men with the hollow eyes of those who had seen too much and lost everything. Many bore scars from previous conflicts or punishments, and their uniforms hung loose on frames, wasted by poverty and hardship. The Legion's command structure reflected its expendable nature. French officers were assigned to lead the foreign enlisted men, but these positions were often filled by individuals whose own careers had stalled due to disciplinary problems, political unreliability, or social disgrace. This created a toxic dynamic where desperate men were led by compromised officers, resulting in a unit that operated outside normal military conventions from its earliest days. Training was brutal by design, intended not to build conventional soldiers, but to forge survivors capable of operating in the Empire's most hostile environments. Sergeant Major Henri Zimmermann's diary, discovered in 1987, describes training regimens that included 20-hour marches in full equipment, live-fire exercises with minimal safety precautions, and combat scenarios that resulted in actual casualties among recruits. "We were not being trained to fight," Zimmermann wrote, "but to endure whatever hell the Empire might send us into." The psychological conditioning that accompanied this physical training was equally harsh. Legionnaires were systematically isolated from their previous identities and relationships, forbidden from discussing their pasts, and encouraged to view their former lives as dead. This psychological death and rebirth created men who had severed connections with normal moral and social constraints, viewing themselves as already beyond redemption and therefore capable of any action necessary for survival. The economic reality of Legion service completed the picture of desperation that would define the unit's character. While French soldiers served for modest pay and eventual pensions, Legionnaires received minimal compensation and faced uncertain futures upon discharge. Many re-enlisted repeatedly, not out of loyalty to France, but because military service had rendered them unfit for civilian life. Captain Maurice Leclerc observed that veteran legionnaires existed in a state of permanent exile from normal society, bound to the Legion not by duty, but by their complete inability to imagine any other existence. Indeed, the Algerian Crucible. The French conquest of Algeria became the crucible in which the Legion's brutal character was forged, and its most disturbing practices were born. Beginning in 1830, France launched what would become a decades-long campaign to subdue North African resistance, deploying the newly formed Legion as expendable shock troops in a conflict that would test the limits of human endurance and moral boundaries. The initial deployment to Algeria in 1831 immediately exposed the Legion to conditions that would have challenged even veteran units. Legionnaires arrived in a climate that killed Europeans through disease faster than enemy action, facing an indigenous population skilled in guerrilla warfare and intimately familiar with terrain that seemed designed to destroy invading armies. Within months of arrival, entire companies had been decimated not by combat, but by dysentery, typhus, and heat stroke that turned French military camps into open-air morgues. Private Jean-Claude Bosquet's letters to his sister, discovered in family archives in Provence, provide a stark account of the Legion's early Algerian experience. "We are dying faster than we can bury our dead. The heat melts our brains, the water poisons our bowels, and the Arabs strike from shadows we cannot see. Yesterday, we buried 12 men who never fired a shot at the enemy. Today, we will bury more." Bosquet himself would die of fever 3 weeks after writing these words, joining the thousands of legionnaires whose graves marked France's advance across North Africa. The siege of Constantine in 1837 became the Legion's first major test and revealed the savage tactics that would characterize their approach to warfare. As French forces surrounded the ancient city, legionnaires were assigned to the most dangerous assault positions, expected to absorb casualties that regular French units could not sustain. Colonel Pierre Combes, commanding the Legion's assault companies, documented tactics that violated every convention of civilized warfare: the execution of prisoners to conserve supplies, the abandonment of wounded who could not retreat, and the systematic burning of civilian quarters to deny shelter to defenders. Sergeant François Carbuccia's confession, written to a military chaplain before his execution for insubordination, describes the transformation that occurred during the Constantine siege. "We ceased to be soldiers and became something else, animals perhaps, or demons. When hunger came, we took food from civilians. When our wounded slowed our advance, we left them for the Arabs. When prisoners became burdens, we shot them in the back of the head." Indeed, Carbuccia's account details how these practices became normalized within Legion companies, viewed not as atrocities, but as necessary adaptations to impossible circumstances. The psychological impact of Algerian warfare on Legion survivors created a cadre of men fundamentally changed by their experiences. Dr. Auguste Morel, a military physician who treated returning legionnaires, documented symptoms that would later be recognized as severe trauma: persistent nightmares, violent outbursts, inability to form normal relationships, and a complete indifference to violence that shocked even hardened military professionals. "These men have seen the face of hell," Morel wrote, "and it has permanently altered their souls." The tactics developed in Algeria became the template for Legion operations in subsequent conflicts. The abandonment of wounded who could not keep pace became standard practice, justified by commanders as necessary for unit survival, but creating a culture where human life had value only so long as it contributed to military objectives. Captain Edouard Herbinger's field reports describe this evolution with disturbing clinical detachment. The weak are discarded, the hesitant are shot, and the survivors learn that mercy is a luxury we cannot afford. The treatment of enemy prisoners during the Algerian campaigns established patterns of brutality that would follow the Legion throughout its history. Captured fighters were routinely tortured for intelligence, executed to prevent escape attempts during movement, or used as human shields during dangerous operations. These practices were documented not as exceptional events, but as routine procedures in official reports that were classified for over a century due to their explosive content. The confessions emerging from the Algerian period reveal that brutality was not merely tolerated, but actively encouraged by a command structure that viewed conventional military ethics as impediments to imperial objectives. Officers who showed mercy were removed from command, while those who demonstrated ruthless effectiveness were promoted regardless of the methods they employed. This created a system where the most savage individuals rose to positions of authority, perpetuating and intensifying the cycle of violence that would define the Legion's reputation for generations. Spanish carnage and abandonment. The First Carlist War in Spain became the stage for one of the Legion's most catastrophic deployments, a campaign that would decimate the unit while providing some of the most harrowing confessions in military history. In 1835, as Spanish succession disputes erupted into civil war, France dispatched nearly the entire Foreign Legion to support the liberal government against Carlist traditionalists, viewing the conflict as an opportunity to eliminate political enemies while advancing French interests on the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish deployment represented a cynical calculation by French leadership that revealed the true nature of the Legion's intended role. Rather than supporting the expedition with adequate supplies, reinforcements, or strategic planning, French commanders treated it as a convenient method of disposing of troublesome foreigners while maintaining plausible deniability for French involvement. Colonel Conrad, commanding the Legion's deployment, received explicit orders that no French resources were to be committed to supporting Legion operations beyond the minimum necessary to maintain the fiction of military assistance. The reality of Spanish service quickly exposed legionnaires to a level of abandonment that shocked even men accustomed to harsh treatment. Captain Henri Bernel's dispatches, declassified only in the 1970s, describe units operating without pay, medical support, or reliable supply lines while facing an enemy that had intimate knowledge of local terrain and enjoyed popular support in contested regions. "We are ghosts fighting for a cause we do not understand," Bernel wrote, "abandoned by the nation we serve and despised by the people we are meant to protect." Private Louis Rouget's diary, discovered in a monastery near Vitoria, provides a ground-level view of the Legion's Spanish ordeal that reads like a descent into hell. Rouget describes companies reduced to foraging for food in civilian areas, leading to conflicts with Spanish allies that further isolated the Legion from any source of support. "We steal from those we came to help," he wrote, "and they curse us in languages we do not speak while we die, for reasons no one can explain." The tactical situation in Spain forced legionnaires into a type of warfare that broke down all remaining military discipline and moral constraints. Facing Carlist forces that employed guerrilla tactics, took no prisoners, and enjoyed sanctuary in mountainous terrain that favored defenders, Legion units adapted by adopting equally savage methods. Sergeant Major Paul Ducasse's confession describes the systematic torture of captured Carlists for intelligence, the execution of Spanish civilians suspected of providing enemy support, and retaliatory massacres that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The psychological pressure of fighting an unpopular war with inadequate support created conditions that drove many legionnaires to complete mental breakdown. Father Miguel Santamaria, a Spanish priest who ministered to Legion casualties, documented cases of soldiers who had suffered complete psychological collapse. Men who spoke only in whispers, who would not eat food touched by others, who screamed at night and could not be awakened. "The war has destroyed not their bodies, but their souls," Santamaria wrote, "leaving creatures that wear human faces but have lost all human feeling." The Carlist forces' practice of executing captured legionnaires created a cycle of escalating brutality that eliminated any possibility of conventional military conduct. When no quarter was given or expected, Legion units responded by adopting tactics that ensured their own survival at any cost. Lieutenant Auguste Mercier's field reports described the execution of wounded comrades who could not retreat, justified as preventing their capture and inevitable torture by Carlist forces. "We became the executioners of our own brothers," Mercier confessed, "because death by friendly fire was preferable to what the enemy would inflict." The Spanish campaign's conclusion represented not military defeat, but complete abandonment by France. As political calculations shifted and the cost of supporting the Legion became politically inconvenient, French leadership simply withdrew support and left surviving legionnaires to find their own way home or remain in Spain as unwanted foreigners. Of the nearly 4,000 legionnaires deployed to Spain, fewer than 500 returned to French service, with the remainder dead, deserted, or permanently settled in a country that viewed them with suspicion and hostility. The confessions of Spanish campaign survivors reveal men fundamentally transformed by the experience of complete abandonment while fighting in a foreign civil war. These testimonies describe not just physical hardships, but the psychological impact of realizing that their own government viewed them as expendable resources whose deaths would create no domestic political consequences. This knowledge created a nihilistic worldview that would characterize Legion culture for decades. If France could abandon them in Spain, no loyalty was owed to any authority beyond the immediate bonds of survival formed with fellow legionnaires. The Black Flag Wars. The expansion of French colonial control into Indochina during the 1880s brought the Legion face to face with some of the most formidable irregular forces in military history, the Black Flag bands and their Chinese allies. These conflicts, fought in jungle terrain that neutralized European military advantages, produced confessions of such systematic brutality that they remained classified in French military archives until the late 20th century. The Black Flag bands, originally Chinese soldiers who had fled their homeland after the Taiping Rebellion, had evolved into sophisticated military organizations that combined conventional tactics with guerrilla warfare, perfectly adapted to Indochinese conditions. Led by commanders like Liu Yongfu, these forces understood that European armies could be defeated not through direct confrontation, but through systematic attrition that exploited their unfamiliarity with local conditions and dependence on vulnerable supply lines. Captain Theodore Riviere's intelligence reports, written during the early phases of the Tonkin campaign, describe an enemy that challenged every assumption about colonial warfare. These are not the tribal fighters we faced in Africa, Riviere noted, but professional soldiers with modern weapons, excellent intelligence networks, and tactical sophistication that matches our own. They choose when and where to fight, strike without warning, and disappear into terrain that swallows our pursuit columns whole. The defense of Tuyanquang in 1885 became the crucible that tested the Legion against the Black Flag's most sophisticated assault. For months, a small garrison of legionnaires held a fortified position while enemy engineers dug tunnels beneath their defenses, planted massive mines, and conducted siege operations that demonstrated remarkable technical expertise. Sergeant Major Claude Grandidier's day-by-day account of the siege reads like a descent into madness, describing underground warfare in tunnels where men fought with knives and bayonets in complete darkness. The psychological warfare employed by the Black Flags pushed legionnaires beyond the breaking point. Enemy forces would display the mutilated corpses of captured legionnaires within sight of French positions, accompanied by the screams of prisoners being tortured to death just beyond the range of rescue attempts. Private Antoine Mercier's confession describes how these tactics broke the minds of even veteran soldiers. We could hear our comrades dying for days, calling for help we could not provide, begging for death we could not grant them. Some of our own men shot themselves rather than risk such a fate. The tunnel warfare that characterized many Indochinese engagements created conditions of horror that challenged human sanity. Corporal Jean-Baptiste Zimmermann's account of fighting in the tunnels beneath Tuyanquang describes combat in spaces so confined that men could not swing weapons, where the dead could not be removed, and the living fought while standing on the corpses of friends and enemies alike. In the tunnels, we ceased to be human, Zimmermann wrote, becoming creatures that existed only to kill or die in darkness that seemed to have no end. The Black Flag's intelligence networks, which included French-educated Vietnamese who could read intercepted communications and predict French tactical movements, created a level of strategic disadvantage that drove Legion commanders to desperate measures. Colonel Henry Laurent's classified reports described the systematic torture of suspected informants, the burning of entire villages believed to harbor enemy agents, and the execution of Vietnamese civilians whose only crime was literacy in French. "We strike at shadows," Laurent admitted, "killing innocents because we cannot identify the guilty." The jungle environment of Indochina eliminated many traditional military advantages while creating new forms of suffering that tested human endurance. Disease killed more legionnaires than enemy action, with malaria, dysentery and tropical infections reducing entire companies to walking corpses who continued fighting only because rest meant certain death. Dr. Paul Roux, the expedition's chief medical officer, documented mortality rates that approached 80% in some units, with survivors often permanently damaged by diseases for which no effective treatment existed. The adaptation to jungle warfare required legionnaires to abandon conventional tactics and adopt methods that horrified even hardened veterans of African campaigns. Silent movement through dense undergrowth, the use of poisoned weapons adapted from local practices, and the employment of torture techniques learned from interrogating captured Black Flag soldiers all became standard practices that were documented in field manuals that remained classified for decades. The confessions emerging from the Black Flag Wars reveal a transformation in Legion culture that went beyond previous adaptations to harsh conditions. The combination of sophisticated enemy opposition, environmental challenges that killed indiscriminately, and complete isolation from European civilization created a military unit that operated according to rules that bore no resemblance to conventional warfare. These men had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to normal military service or civilian life: the culture of vengeance. By the late 1880s, the accumulated experiences of Algeria, Spain, and Indochina had created within the French Foreign Legion a military culture unlike any other in European armies. This was not merely a matter of harsh discipline or brutal tactics, but a fundamental transformation in how legionnaires viewed themselves, their enemies, and the nature of warfare itself. The confessions from this period reveal men who had moved beyond conventional military ethics into a realm where vengeance became both tactical doctrine and psychological necessity. The Legion's code of vengeance emerged from practical necessities that gradually became ingrained cultural practices. When operating in hostile territory, where capture meant torture and execution, the taking of prisoners became not just dangerous, but actively counterproductive. Captain Louis Herbinger's tactical manual, circulated only within Legion units, explicitly stated that mercy shown to enemies will be interpreted as weakness and will result in increased casualties among our own men. This philosophy quickly evolved beyond mere tactical consideration into a fundamental aspect of Legion identity. The abandonment of wounded comrades, initially justified as military necessity, became ritualized into a practice that combined practical considerations with twisted concepts of honor. Sergeant Major Auguste Delacroix's confession describes the execution of seriously wounded legionnaires not as acts of mercy, but as assertions of power over their own fate. "We refuse to allow our enemies the satisfaction of our suffering," Delacroix wrote, "choosing death on our own terms rather than submission to their brutality." These killings were accompanied by ceremonies that transformed murder into martyrdom, creating psychological frameworks that allowed survivors to process acts that would have horrified civilian society. The systematic torture of prisoners, initially employed to gather tactical intelligence, evolved into elaborate rituals that served psychological rather than military purposes. Father Antoine Moreau, a military chaplain who witnessed these practices, documented techniques that were designed not to extract information, but to provide psychological release for legionnaires traumatized by their own losses. They torture not to learn, Moreau observed, but to transfer their own pain onto others, seeking relief through the infliction of suffering they have endured themselves. The collection of trophies from fallen enemies became another manifestation of this culture of vengeance that revealed the depth of psychological transformation within Legion ranks. Private Henri Bouchard's inventory of his personal effects, conducted before his death from fever, lists human ears, scalps, and finger bones taken from Black Flag soldiers, Chinese troops, and Arab fighters. These items were not collected as proof of kills for military recognition, but as personal totems that provided psychological comfort through physical connection to defeated enemies. The development of a distinct Legion language and ritual practice demonstrated how completely these men had separated themselves from European civilization. Words and phrases developed within Legion units often had no equivalent in standard French, describing concepts and experiences that existed only within their unique military culture. Lieutenant Paul Rybel's linguistic studies of Legion argot identified over 200 terms that related specifically to different methods of execution, torture, and the disposal of human remains, a vocabulary of violence that reflected the centrality of brutality to Legion identity. The religious practices that developed within Legion units represented a complete perversion of Christian doctrine that would have been recognizable to medieval crusaders, but horrified contemporary European churchmen. Legion chaplains, often men whose own careers had been compromised by scandal or unorthodox beliefs, conducted services that explicitly blessed acts of vengeance and portrayed mercy as weakness, contrary to divine will. Father Claude Bertrand's sermons, preserved in Legion archives, contain passages that directly contradict fundamental Christian teachings about forgiveness and compassion. The Brotherhood of Blood, an informal organization that developed within Legion ranks, created bonds between legionnaires that superseded all other loyalties, including those owed to France or military authority. Members of this brotherhood swore oaths to avenge fallen comrades regardless of military orders, political considerations, or personal cost. Colonel Etienne Flandin's investigation into this organization revealed that it had effectively created a parallel command structure based entirely on vengeance obligations that could override official military discipline. The psychological impact of this culture of vengeance on individual legionnaires created men who were capable of extreme violence, but incapable of normal human relationships. Dr. Maurice Lecrivain's study of Legion veterans who had returned to civilian life documented individuals who could not form emotional attachments, who responded to minor provocations with lethal violence, and who suffered from persistent delusions that they were under attack by enemies who had been dead for years. These men had been so thoroughly conditioned to view life through the lens of vengeance that they could not function in societies that operated according to different principles. Testimonies of the damned. The personal accounts left by individual legionnaires provide the most disturbing window into the psychological and moral transformation that military service in the 19th century Foreign Legion inflicted upon human beings. These testimonies, written as private confessions, deathbed statements, and letters never intended for public view, reveal the internal experience of men who had crossed moral boundaries from which there could be no return. Private Jean-Baptiste Kerner's final letter to his estranged wife, written hours before his execution for the murder of a fellow legionnaire, provides a chilling self-assessment of his transformation during 7 years of Legion service. "I write to you not as the man you married, but as something else entirely," Kerner began. "Something that war and the desert have created from the remains of who I once was. I remember loving you, remember feeling tenderness and hope, but these emotions have been burned away by acts I cannot describe and sights I cannot forget. Sergeant Major Claude Grandjean's diary, discovered in his effects after his death from malaria in Tonkin, documents the systematic degradation of human empathy that Legion service imposed upon its members. "Today, we executed 6 Chinese prisoners who could no longer march," Grandjean wrote with clinical detachment. "I felt nothing as their blood soaked into the jungle earth. Once this absence of feeling would have terrified me. Now it seems natural, perhaps even necessary for survival in this place where compassion equals death." The confession of Lieutenant Auguste Moreau, written to a military chaplain before a disciplinary hearing for atrocities committed against Arab civilians, reveals the twisted logic that legionnaires used to justify actions that violated every principle of civilized conduct. "We are no longer subject to the moral laws that govern civilized men," Moreau argued, "because we no longer live in civilization. We exist in hell, and hell has different rules. To survive in hell, one must become a demon." Private Louis Zimmerman's account of the massacre at Sidi Ibrahim demonstrates how quickly normal men could be transformed into instruments of systematic brutality. "The Arabs had tortured our captain to death while we listened to his screams," Zimmerman recounted. "When we finally broke their position, we took no prisoners. Men, women, children, all died by our hands. I personally killed an Arab woman who begged for mercy in French. I felt nothing but satisfaction as her blood stained my bayonet." The psychological mechanisms that allowed legionnaires to process their own actions are revealed in Corporal Henri Ducasse's extended meditation on the nature of evil, written during a fever delirium in a field hospital. "Evil is not the absence of good," Ducasse wrote, "but the presence of necessity. We commit acts that civilized men call atrocities because civilization is a luxury we cannot afford. In the crucible of imperial warfare, morality melts away, leaving only the imperative to survive and the obligation to avenge our fallen brothers." The dehumanization of enemies that facilitated extreme brutality is documented in numerous Legion testimonies that describe local populations not as human beings, but as obstacles to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. Private Antoine Mercier's letters home consistently refer to Arabs as animals, Chinese as insects, and Spanish civilians as vermin, language that reflected not casual prejudice, but systematic psychological conditioning designed to eliminate empathy that might interfere with military effectiveness. The impact of Legion service on religious faith provides another window into the depth of psychological transformation that these men experienced. Sergeant Major Paul Delacroix's theological reflections, written as a series of letters to a seminary classmate who had become a parish priest, reveal a man struggling to reconcile Christian doctrine with lived experience. "If God exists," Delacroix wrote, "he has abandoned this place and these people to forces that mock his supposed love and mercy. We serve not divine justice, but imperial necessity, and our souls are the price of French civilization in the colonies." The testimonies also reveal the complete breakdown of traditional military hierarchy and discipline that occurred when Legion units operated beyond the oversight of conventional military authority. Lieutenant Edouard Herbinger's account of a mutiny against his own captain describes soldiers who had become accountable only to their own conception of honor and survival. Discipline collapsed not through cowardice, but through the realization that our officers were as lost as we were, Herbinger observed. Authority based on rank meant nothing when death was the common fate of all, regardless of position. These confessions collectively paint a picture of military service that permanently damaged every man who survived it, creating individuals who could never again function as normal members of civilized society. The testimonies describe not heroic soldiers defending their nation, but broken human beings who had been systematically stripped of their humanity in service to imperial ambitions that they neither understood nor supported. The mechanics of brutality. The systematic brutality that characterized the 19th century French Foreign Legion was not the result of individual pathology or momentary lapses in discipline, but emerged from carefully developed institutional practices designed to transform ordinary men into instruments of imperial violence. The confessions of Legion veterans reveal the specific mechanisms through which human beings were conditioned to commit acts that would have been unthinkable in civilian life. The initiation process for new legionnaires served as the first stage in breaking down conventional moral constraints. Recruit Marcel Bouchard's account of his first months in Algeria describes hazing rituals that went far beyond traditional military indoctrination to include forced participation in the execution of deserters, the torture of prisoners, and the desecration of enemy corpses. "They made us complicit from the beginning," Bouchard wrote, "so that we could never claim innocence or distance ourselves from what the Legion had become." The practice of collective punishment created psychological dynamics that eliminated individual moral agency by making survival dependent on group solidarity. When one legionnaire violated orders or showed mercy to enemies, entire units faced reduction of rations, extended marches, or assignment to the most dangerous duties. Sergeant Major Louis Grandjean's testimony describes how this system created peer pressure that enforced brutality more effectively than direct commands. "We policed ourselves," Grandjean admitted, "because compassion shown by one man could mean death for all." The rotation of personnel through different types of atrocities ensured that no legionnaire could maintain psychological distance from the Legion's most brutal practices. Captain Théodore Riviere's duty rosters, preserved in classified military archives, reveal systematic assignment of soldiers to executions, torture sessions, and punitive operations against civilians. "Every man must blood his hands," Riviere explained in a letter to his superiors, "so that none can claim moral superiority over his comrades or challenge the necessity of our methods." The development of specialized vocabulary and ritual practices surrounding violence created cultural frameworks that normalized extreme brutality. Private Henri Zimmermann's glossary of Legion terms, compiled during his service in Indochina, includes over 50 different words for various methods of execution, torture, and corpse disposal. These terms were not merely descriptive, but carried moral valences that portrayed brutality as professional competence and mercy as dangerous weakness. The medical corps played a crucial role in maintaining the Legion's capacity for violence by developing treatments that kept traumatized soldiers functional while preventing psychological recovery that might lead to moral awakening. Dr. Auguste Moreau's clinical notes describe therapeutic interventions designed not to heal trauma, but to channel it into productive aggression against designated enemies. "We treat not to cure, but to maintain combat effectiveness," Moreau wrote, "healing the body while preserving the rage that makes these men useful instruments of imperial policy." The Legion's justice system abandoned conventional military law in favor of summary proceedings that reinforced the culture of brutality. Trials for military crimes became rituals that celebrated violence while punishing weakness or humanitarian impulses. Lieutenant Paul Reibel's account of a court-martial for the murder of Arab civilians describes a proceeding where the accused was acquitted, not because he was innocent, but because his victims were deemed unworthy of legal protection. The systematic dehumanization of enemy populations required constant reinforcement through propaganda, ritual practices, and psychological conditioning that went far beyond normal military training. Chaplain Claude Bertrand's sermons, preserved in Legion archives, contain explicit theological justifications for genocide, torture, and the complete elimination of indigenous resistance to French rule. "Our enemies are not merely military opponents, but obstacles to Christian civilization," Bertrand preached. "Their destruction is not murder, but divine mandate." Nanes The creation of false historical narratives that portrayed Legion brutalities as heroic actions required the participation of military historians, journalists, and government officials in systematic deception designed to maintain public support for imperial policies. Colonel Etienne Flandin's correspondence with Parisian newspaper editors reveals coordination between military authorities and civilian media to suppress accounts of atrocities while promoting stories that portrayed legionnaires as heroic defenders of French civilization. The psychological impact of these institutional mechanisms created individuals who were not merely capable of extreme violence, but required it for psychological stability. Veterans who attempted to return to civilian life often suffered complete mental breakdown when removed from the cultural context that had given meaning to their actions. Dr. Maurice Lecrivain's study of discharged legionnaires found that over 70% became either chronic alcoholics, violent criminals, or committed suicide within 5 years of leaving military service. The mechanics of brutality developed by the Foreign Legion proved so effective that they were later adopted by other European colonial forces and, with modifications, by totalitarian movements that sought to transform ordinary citizens into instruments of systematic oppression. The testimonies of Legion veterans provide a blueprint for understanding how civilized societies can create institutions that systematically strip away human moral constraints while maintaining the fiction that such violence serves noble purposes. The price of survival, the ultimate cost of service in the 19th century French Foreign Legion, cannot be measured in casualty statistics or military effectiveness, but in the complete moral and psychological destruction of human beings who were systematically transformed into instruments of imperial violence. The confessions of Legion veterans reveal men who had traded their humanity for survival, only to discover that what survived was no longer recognizably human. The physical toll of Legion service was documented in military medical records that revealed mortality rates approaching those of medieval armies. Dr. Paul Roux's comprehensive study of Legion casualties in Indochina found that disease killed 3 times as many men as enemy action, with malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections creating a medical environment where death was not merely possible, but statistically inevitable. We were dying organisms from the moment we set foot in these colonies, wrote Private Auguste Mercier. The only question was whether we would die quickly through violence or slowly through disease. The psychological damage inflicted by Legion service proved even more devastating than physical casualties. Veterans who survived their contracts returned to Europe as broken men incapable of normal human relationships or civilian employment. Father Miguel Santamaria, who ministered to former legionnaires in Marseille, documented cases of men who had lost the ability to experience normal human emotions, who responded to minor provocations with lethal violence, and who suffered from persistent delusions that they remained under attack by enemies who had been dead for years. The economic exploitation of legionnaires created a system where men sold their lives in installments while receiving compensation that barely covered subsistence needs. Unlike regular French soldiers who served for defined periods with guaranteed pensions, legionnaires existed in a state of perpetual indebtedness to military authorities who controlled every aspect of their existence. Private Jean-Claude Bosquet's financial records, preserved in family archives, show a man who served 7 years in Africa and Asia while accumulating debts for equipment, medical care, and basic necessities that exceeded his total pay by over 300%. The social isolation imposed on Legion veterans created a permanent underclass of men who could neither return to their countries of origin nor integrate into French society. Former legionnaires were viewed with suspicion by civilian authorities, who understood that these men had been systematically brutalized and might pose threats to public order. Captain Henri Bernel's post-service correspondence reveals a man desperate for employment, but rejected by every civilian institution that learned of his military background. "We are ghosts haunting the margins of the civilization we served," Burnell wrote. "Too dangerous for normal society, but too damaged to serve any useful purpose." The impact of Legion service on family relationships provides another measure of the human cost of imperial military service. The letters of Marie Kerner, widow of executed legionnaire Jean-Baptiste Kerner, describe a man who returned from Africa as a stranger incapable of normal human affection. "The man who came back was not my husband," she wrote, "but something wearing his face that had forgotten how to love or be loved. He spoke only of death and violence, saw enemies in every shadow, and could not bear to be touched by human hands." The sexual violence that characterized Legion operations created additional layers of trauma that destroyed any possibility of normal, intimate relationships. The testimonies describe systematic rape as a weapon of war, forced prostitution of captured women, and sexual torture techniques that were employed not for military advantage, but for psychological gratification. Sergeant Major Claude Grandidier's confession includes detailed accounts of sexual atrocities that he describes with the same clinical detachment used for other forms of violence, revealing the complete moral numbness that Legion service imposed upon its veterans. The addiction to violence that developed among long-term legionnaires created men who could not function in peaceful environments, but required constant conflict to maintain psychological stability. Dr. Auguste Moreau's clinical observations describe veterans who deliberately provoked fights with civilians, who volunteered for the most dangerous military assignments, and who seemed incapable of experiencing satisfaction except through the infliction of pain on others. "They have become addicted to brutality," Moreau noted, requiring ever-increasing doses of violence to achieve the psychological equilibrium that normal men find through peaceful activities. The spiritual dimension of Legion service created additional forms of damage that went beyond psychological trauma to encompass fundamental questions about human nature and divine justice. The confessions reveal men who had lost all religious faith through witnessing and participating in atrocities that seemed to mock any conception of benevolent divine authority. Private Louis Rouget's theological reflections, written during a fever delirium, conclude that God either does not exist or is a sadist who delights in human suffering. Either way, prayer is useless and morality is an illusion. The multi-generational impact of Legion service extended the human cost beyond individual veterans to their families and communities. The children of former legionnaires, raised by fathers incapable of normal emotional expression and traumatized by experiences they could neither understand nor discuss, often developed their own psychological problems that perpetuated cycles of violence and dysfunction. Social worker Marie-Claire Dubois documented families where Legion veterans had transmitted their trauma to children who had never experienced warfare, but exhibited symptoms identical to those of combat veterans. The ultimate price of survival in the Foreign Legion was the complete transformation of human beings into something that could no longer be considered fully human. The testimonies reveal men who had retained the physical appearance and basic cognitive functions of human beings, while losing the emotional, moral, and spiritual qualities that define humanity. They had survived their service, but what survived bore only superficial resemblance to what they had been before, donning the Legion's uniform and crossing the threshold into imperial violence.